Welcome back to the Ed Morrissey Show podcast. I am honored to welcome back an old friend, Francis X. Rocca of the Wall Street Journal, one of the best Vaticanistas that there is, and he's on Twitter at Francis X. Rocca, R-O-C-C-A, and he is on top of everything that's going on at the Holy See, and really an extension beyond that. And his latest report, which was on Friday, actually kind of speaks to that, which is the anger that Central and Eastern European Catholics are expressing over Pope Francis's remarks about, Peter the Great and Catherine the Great, maybe not Ivan the Terrible, but Russian imperialism at a time when Russian imperialism is manifesting itself in an invasion of at least a partly Catholic country, Ukraine. Frank, first off, thanks for doing this. I know that you're a busy man, but this is becoming a real problem, I think, for the Catholic Church in relation to bonds of affection that John Paul II helped to build, 40 years ago, 30 years ago.
Well, first of all, thanks, Ed. Glad to be here. It's always an honor and a pleasure. Yeah, that's right. This latest remarks that the Pope made in late August were only the latest blow. I think that people, certainly in Ukraine, there's no question that people in Ukraine, no one denies that, Catholics and non-Catholics are very, very disappointed by the Pope's stance on the war and toward Russia. But it's also in Poland and Lithuania, which are majority Catholic countries. Croatia's a majority Catholic country, but also in other countries. The Catholics are in particular are very, very distressed, and they tend to say, well, the Pope doesn't understand Europe, he doesn't understand Russia, and I think they also see it as well. I think you have to go back to what the Pope understands about this war, and I think the way I put it simply is that the Pope sees this as a war between the United States and Russia, between two empires, between NATO and i.e. the U.S. and Russia, and the Ukrainians are the victims. They're caught in the middle. So that's how he's able to say always, every day, and no doubt very deeply, sincerely, how sad he is for what he calls martyred Ukraine, but at the same time, to not put all the blame on Russia, because he has suggested several times that Russia was provoked by NATO expansion, and that's why Major Archbishop Shevchuk, the leader of the Greek Catholics in Ukraine, who is an old friend of the Pope, he knew him from Argentina because they were both bishops there years ago, and he says the Pope is an Argentinian, and that explains his attitude toward Europe and the United States. He's very mistrustful. So you hear this again. Talking to people in these countries, I heard this over and over again. They all said, even people who are kind of trying to defend the Pope, they're all saying, well, he's a South American. He's not a European. And so I think that's it's frustrating for them because they believe that the result is that he's not standing up he's not identifying clearly who's the aggressor and who's the victim. That's what they keep saying.
Frank, sometimes when I'm talking with friends of mine who are not Catholics, who ask me about the doctrine of papal infallibility, I usually have to come up with sort of reductio ad absurdum explanations to explain this doctrine, which is that if the Pope tells you that the Cleveland Browns are going to win the Super Bowl, that is not an infallible statement. You are free to disagree with that, and probably for very good reasons. On the other hand, when the Pope speaks on matters of doctrine in conjunction with the entirety of the Episcopal synod, that's when infallibility on doctrine takes place. I think I have a new explanation here, which is, when the Pope speaks about Russian imperialism as a political matter, he's not acting infallibly. He's acting as a normal fallible human being doing fallible things. And this is, I think, a pretty good example of this, is that of this difference, is that this is not a doctrinal issue. It's arguably maybe something that Pope Francis should have recognized and done some more work on prior to speaking out. And that seems to be sort of a continuing thing with this particular Pope. You had two preceding popes who were very, very careful and very, very particular about, pronouncements, statements, and were very careful about language to make sure that they were not misunderstood. And Benedict, even with that, occasionally had issues with things that he said in public. Pope Francis is very obviously a pastorally oriented person, and in this case seems to be speaking a little bit, out of turn, and maybe with not recognizing the fact that maybe he doesn't understand, the entire context of how this plays in Europe as opposed to how it played in South America, during the Cold War.
Yeah, I think there's something to that. I mean, there's the old crack in Washington about that a gaffe is when a politician tells the truth. So maybe you can adopt that to an ecclesial realm. And so for religious leaders, I don't know, but I think he knows what he thinks, and I think that it's not that if he needs to sit around with experts in international relations and history and so forth, and then he would change his mind. I doubt that. He's 86 years old. He's been around. He has a view of the world. On the other hand, he probably would formulate differently what he said to the Russian Catholic youth at the end of August. That was the latest problem. And I think what he was trying to do was, it's interesting, but I think he was being perhaps he was overthinking it, but he was talking, let's remember, it's interesting. It's not an excuse, but it's interesting. I think he was talking to Russian Catholic youth. Now, Catholics are a real minority in Russia. There are about 1 million all told of various kinds. And in a country of, 250 million or 300 or something like that. But in any case, and more to the point, I think there is definitely the strong idea, and Putin certainly has emphasized this, that to be Russian is to be Orthodox, right? And it's very much part of the Russian identity. So he was telling these Russian Catholics. I think Russian Catholics, by the way, are often like ethnically German or Polish or something. But in any case, he was trying to tell them, you are Russian. You are Russian. Because that's what he was saying, that Russia's heritage is your heritage. So I think he was trying to say, you fit in, so to try to smooth that over. And then what he does is he says, he thinks Peter the Great and Catherine the Great were known for looking west, right? They wanted to build strong ties with the West in the 18th century. So I think that's what he was trying to do. He was trying to say, well, look at Peter the Great and Catherine the Great. They were really Russian. They were emperors. They were czars. And yet they were also build a bridge to the West. But he really tied himself in knots because, of course, they were very imperialistic. And then when he tried to explain it a few days later, he said, well, I was thinking of Dostoevsky. It was in the 19th century. So anyway, sorry if we've gone a bit far afield, but I think he probably...
Exactly what we're talking about.
I think you're right. In other words, all that to say, if he had known how it was going to play, he probably wouldn't have put it that way. Let's assume that. But when he says things about NATO provoked this by barking at the gates of Russia, which he said several times, he knows what he's saying, and he knows it's not, it doesn't go over well, and he obviously doesn't care, and he didn't. Sorry.
I mean, that's a political argument, and I'm not saying that popes don't have room to make political arguments. They do. But when they're making political arguments, they're not speaking with the infallible authority of the Holy See. They're speaking under their own authority, and to whatever extent that carries weight in any pope's personal weight in politics is going to be fairly large, right? Just because they're pope. But it's a curious thing because, again, we had centuries of Italian popes who were very well versed in European politics. Some more well versed than maybe they should have been if you go back a few centuries. But then we followed up with two popes from arguably Central Europe. Poland is maybe Eastern Europe. It could be legitimately called Eastern Europe, but also still very well versed in what was going on the ground in the Cold War and the the two, empires, if you want to refer to the U.S. as an empire, who didn't make this mistake. And it leads me to wonder whether or not this type of thing, and maybe even Pope Francis's sort of predilection for speaking off the cuff and being less careful in his language, is resonating among the cardinals at the Vatican, who, Pope Francis being 86, they're obviously going to have to start thinking at some point about what they're going to want in the next pontificate, whether or not that this is something that is going to percolate, or whether or not people even think about this until the time comes to even consider that question.
Well, I mean, to be fair, I mean, the Benedict, of course, there were a number of occasions where he provoked a really strong reaction, negative reaction, with certain statements he made that had a geopolitical or a political. The most famous is the Regensburg address, which was not off the cuff. It was carefully written, and where he did, and it's still, if you read it, I mean, it's not it obscured the real message of the address, which was about all kinds of other things. But that part where he did quote a very inflammatory medieval description of Islam and of the Prophet Muhammad, which created a big, and I'm sure because afterwards he did walk it back a bit, that he would have done that differently if he could have gone and redone it. And there were other occasions, and whether or not you think the reactions were fair, they were negative. I mean, for example, he talked about protection of minorities, Christian minorities in Egypt. This was a much lesser incident, but which from a Western point of view seemed quite reasonable, because Christians are a minority in Egypt. But in that context, it had a different resonance, where it made it sound like they were marginalized, whereas the Egyptians pride themselves, at least in principle, on the Copts are integrated. And so that went over really badly. He was criticized by Muslims and by Christians in Egypt. So in other words, people step in it even when they have well-prepared statements. But yeah, I mean, I think the people we talked to, no one suggested that this is driving people away from the Catholic Church or anything in Eastern Europe or Central Europe, but it's just Francis himself that they're very disappointed in.
Well, and again, I mean, I think that this is, like you said, I mean, I'm sure if I went back and looked for it, there'd be something that John Paul II said that didn't go over well. And maybe you have a better sense of that than I do, because you're a lot closer to it. Again, popes make mistakes, right? They don't make mistakes on doctrine when they're in union with the bishops, but they do make mistakes in other phases of their lives. This happens to be one of them. But it is sort of this consistent thing. And it's been a, it's been a continuing thing. Obviously, he believes that this is sort of a pox upon both houses thing, from his perspective as somebody who grew up in South America, came of age in South America during the, this two superpower Cold War environment, and sees it as just an extension of both sides being bad. Lithuania, I mean, you have the quote from the person in Lithuania who said, if it wasn't for NATO, it would have been us. It wouldn't have been Ukraine. And I think that that's something that is, worthy of, it's a worthy addition to that, because this is a real concern. I mean, and this isn't the first time that Putin has done this. He did this in Georgia in 2008. He did it to Ukraine in 2014. And this is a full-out conquest invasion, and one would expect the Catholic Church to have something to say about that. And I think that the intention here is to be open to being a, what's the word for this? A non-biased party,
neutral.
A neutral mediator, right? Is to leave the Vatican open in a traditional role for the Vatican to be a place of neutral mediation between warring parties. But I don't know that's not hasn't been successful so far, and I don't know that there's even anything percolating along those lines. Have you heard anything percolating along those lines?
No, neither side is interested in mediation, and why would the Vatican be the mediator? I mean, but the couple of things. Also, that's a tradition from the 19th century, basically. I mean, from when the Holy See ceased to be a real geopolitical power of any consequence at all, when it ceased in the 19th century, when it was lost to the Papal States, and so that's not a very old tradition. But okay, and neutrality, of course. Has not had a uniformly celebrated history. Pius XII is a controversy that keeps coming up over and over and over again. And one of the arguments made is that he was trying to maintain a kind of neutrality there during the Second World War, which doesn't look so great in retrospect. But I'd say it's interesting. One thing is that the Pope, with his emphasis on empires, in a curious way, seems to almost, from one point of view, underrate the importance of sovereign nation states. I mean, exactly. The Lithuanian former ambassador of the Holy See was saying, if not, we were all thinking, what is he talking about NATO being a provocation? We need NATO to protect us. And from the Ukrainian point of view, I think that his analysis that these are just two superpowers, poor martyred Ukraine. If only these people would stop. But they don't see it. They don't see it that way. They see it themselves as they're defending their country against an unjust aggressor. And so, no, they don't want to make peace where they give up part of their territory that was taken from them aggressively, and just to say, well, we have to understand from Russia's point of view. So it's funny, they don't feel that he's identifying with them. And a number of people did say to us, yes, John Paul was better on understanding the idea of the integrity of the sovereign state and why that's important. So paradoxically, perhaps, or ironically, maybe, Francis's suspicion about empires is in a way kind of almost conceding them something. I don't know. I also think that it's true that he sees things in this way, but I think he's got a particular thing about the U.S. I mean, I think, and that's what Shevchuk said, the Archbishop Shevchuk, and many people have said it, and of course that spills over, as we know, into his problems with the U.S. hierarchy, much of the U.S. hierarchy, not all of it. I think he just, I believe he never, before he went to the United States as Pope in 2015, I understand, and this came from the Holy See press office at the time, so we assume it's true, he never had set foot in the United States except to change planes in Miami, So he was the Cardinal Archbishop of Buenos Aires for 15 years. He had dealings with high-level prelates in the United States and everything. He's in the same part of the world, and you'd think that's kind of, I mean, that shows he really probably wasn't very eager to visit the United States if it didn't happen once in all those years. Well, so that's there's nothing sacred about the United States. I mean,
Right.
There's a right to his view.
No, I mean, and I agree. I mean, it's a universal church. When it comes to church matters, it's a universal church. So I don't really have an issue with that either. But I will bring something else up, and I'm not even sure if you know anything about this. But I live in Texas, and I don't actually live in Bishop Strickland's diocese, but it's kind of big news down here. The papal visitation that took place, because Strickland, to be fair, kind of shot off his mouth a little bit about Pope Francis, which is, I don't care what organization you're in. If you're telling people in public that the CEO of your organization is undermining the organization, you're probably going to get a visit from the Home Office, right? I don't really have an issue with that, but apart from that, Francis has commented on American conservatives as being somehow either misinformed or malicious. I forget exactly what the phraseology there was, but I can tell you it didn't go over well among American, Catholics with a more conservative bent. And it does seem like, again, maybe play into the exact same thing where he's just kind of a U.S. skeptical kind of guy and doesn't really appreciate the input from the U.S. on these types of matters.
Well, again, Shevchuk and others, but Shevchuk, I go back to Shevchuk because they knew each other, and because he's a very high-ranking leader in the church. But he said he generalized and said it was an Argentinian thing. But I mean, the Pope said that there are parts of the church in the United States that are backwardist. I can't remember the Italian word he used, but it's translated that way in the official Vatican translation. Backwardist, reactionary pockets. He didn't say the whole church is like that, but there's no question that the majority of the hierarchy hasn't adopted his agenda, and we have this on the authority of his cardinals. The cardinals that he created in the U.S. hierarchy. Cardinal McElroy has been probably most explicit about this, but also Cardinal Supich and Cardinal Tobin have basically said we're not going the way that the Holy Father wants us to go, which is to say that yes, abortion is a priority, but it's not the preeminent priority. It stands alongside, migration and environment and poverty and so on. We have it on their authority, and these are the men that he's appointed to the synod, personally appointed to the synod, and they say the U.S. hierarchy is not in sync with him. So we don't even have to read his mind. I mean, we can take it. They can take it that they're reflecting the Pope's thinking. I think pretty that seems pretty fair. So he doesn't. And now, of course, that doesn't. I mean, that's not. The Biden administration doesn't make the policy, to say the least, doesn't make the policy for the USCCB. But maybe it's no coincidence it's the U.S. But it's, by the way, in parentheses, he obviously didn't agree. The Pope obviously doesn't agree with Donald Trump about a lot of things. But it's funny that Donald Trump's policy on Ukraine would probably be closer to his, I should think. I mean, he'd probably, assuming that Trump would be less hawkish on this war, which is what the impression one's getting, right? It's interesting that actually they would be closer on that.
I think you're absolutely correct about that. I think that they would be closer on that. Certainly not on immigration, certainly not on other issues. But yes, on that issue, absolutely. I agree with you. All right, well, we're almost out of time, and it's been great catching up with you, Frank. But what else are you working on? What else should we be looking at the Wall Street Journal that you're working on right now?
Well, we've got a lot happening coming up, and of course, we've got this big synod, which we haven't really talked about, but that's starting very soon, starting on October 4. And who knows what will come of it? I mean, there's a lot of apprehension. There's a lot of hope among some, a lot of apprehension, anxiety, and among others, a lot of certainly controversy. It's a curious thing because these are hot topics and people are coming from all over the world, 400 plus bishops and others. And so it's a very high profile event. A lot of media will be here, Catholic media, but also secular media. But at the same time, they're trying, the Vatican is trying to manage coverage very carefully and only get people to rely on briefings. They don't want people to speak to the press about what's going on in the chamber. So that's going to make it interesting, kind of a challenge to cover. But certainly I expect that we'll be hearing about a lot of that. And certainly we'll be reporting on it. Also on October 4th, the Pope publishes another encyclical on the environment, sequel to his 2015 encyclical Laudato Si. And I think they just announced that it's going to be called, and now I've forgotten the new name. It's slightly different. It's Laudate, I forgot the second word. But in any case, so that's coming out on October 4th. So that's obviously an area of interest. Well, having had the opportunity to cover one synod, they're fascinating to cover. I did the 2015 Synod on the Family, and that was 2014 Synod of the Family. It was absolutely fascinating. The whole synod and synodality thing is interesting. We got to get you back on to talk a little bit more about that, because we can't do that in 2 minutes. But it will be interesting to see what questions come up and what questions will not be pursued. This is just breaking this morning. There's a Swiss bishop, say that 5 times fast, a Swiss bishop, Felix Gemmer of Basel, who is wanting to discuss priestly celibacy, which of course is a practice and is open for debate, and also ordaining women, which Pope Francis himself has said multiple times, this is not a practice, this is doctrine, and we're not going to discuss it any further. And just briefly, I'll just ask you this. I mean, is this really kind of going to be a free-for-all with the synod and synodality, or has the Vatican
not just look to discipline the coverage, but also what's actually going to take place when all these bishops arrive.
Well, all right. Look, it's hard to imagine. I mean, there are one of the innovations, as you know, is a lot of lay people, the women and men, who are going to be actually be able to vote on the resolutions or whatever. And it's hard to believe. And some of them are very progressive, and so are some of the bishops. And so it's hard to believe that no one's going to bring some of these things up. As for it's important to remember two things. I think one is that the Pope has never actually ruled out the ordination of women as deacons. So yes. He hasn't ruled that out. He has shown, I would say, less than great enthusiasm for it. He's appointed 2 commissions, and neither of which have led to any changes. But the other thing is that in 2019, there was a synod on the Amazon, and that body voted, and that was mostly bishops, and that body voted. A supermajority voted to loosen the practice of celibacy, at least in the Amazon region. But naturally, that would have led to other expansion. And it also voted on a simple majority voted for ordaining women as deacons. And the Pope didn't. He just was silent on both recommendations. He didn't take up either recommendation for whatever reason. So will those come up again? I'm sure. But will the Pope have a different idea this time? I don't know why he would, but he might.
Right. That's what makes it fun, kind of.
Yeah.
And that's the reason why people need to be following Frank on Twitter, or X if you prefer, at Francis X Rocca, Rocca. And if you're not already subscribing to the Wall Street Journal, you should, if for no other reason to get Frank's coverage at the Vatican. There's a lot of other good reasons to subscribe to the Wall Street Journal, but that's chief among them for me. And I always appreciate Frank's reporting, and I always appreciate when I get a chance to talk to you, Frank. Thank you so much for doing this today.
No, thank you, Ed. It's always a pleasure. Thank you.